I want you to ask yourself, are you Saul's servant or are you God's servant? Are you a servant of Saul or God? Everything I'm going to teach on today is going to come from 1 Samuel 17. You can read it in any version. It's going to be the same. I'm reading from the NLT and the New King James. Because I realized God been putting this in my spirit for so long. And it's like the church is falling into a place where they're serving Saul. They're becoming servants of Saul instead of servants of God. They're afraid to speak when God tells them to speak. They're walking in fear instead of boldness. They have the characteristics of a man instead of the characteristic of their father, God. I'm going to read for you guys 1 Samuel 17, verse 8. This is in the NLT. Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. "Why are you coming out to fight me?" he called. "I am the Philistine champion, but you are only the servant of Saul." He said, "You are only the servant of Saul." Everybody in all of Israel, everybody knew who the Israelites were and who their God was. Everybody knew who they were. But when Goliath saw them, he didn't see them as the army of God. He didn't see them as these are the people who God brought from Egypt and brought them here. They defeated nations. He didn't see that. He saw Saul's people. He was boasting like he was bigger than God because they made him feel like he was bigger than God. They were walking around not even knowing who they serve. They were serving Saul and not God, and their opponent was able to see that. They were walking around in fear. If you read up, I want you guys to read all of chapter 17. It's not long. Read it. It's really good. And they described Goliath. He was the giant. He was big. He was bold. He weighed probably around 450 pounds. The armor on him alone was heavy. The armor on him alone was heavy. And they were afraid of him because they thought he was bigger than God. Why? Because they were serving Saul. I'm going to read on. After he said that you are only the servant of Saul, he said, "Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kill me, then he will be your slave. But if I kill him, you will be our slave." He said, "I defy the army of Israel today." You know what defy means? I wrote it down. Defy means, hold on, openly resist or refuse to obey. He was openly resisting and refusing to obey God because they were supposed to be there in God's image and God's name. He said, "I defy the army of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me." And when you go down to verse 11, it said, when Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. Why were they terrified? Because they were not servants of God. They were as weak as the one they were serving. They were as weak as Saul. What falls on the head fall down to the rest of them. Saul was scared. Saul was fearful. They became scared and fearful. They were like the one they were serving. If they were like God, if they were serving God and they knew the God that was in them, they knew the power that was behind them, they knew that all they had to do was come in God's name and that giant would fall, that giant one was not even going to be able to taunt them. He was not going to be able to come every day, walking around for 40 days, morning and evening, presenting himself, taunting them, waiting for one of them to stand up to him. But they didn't come as the servants of God. They came as the servants of Saul. So ask yourself, do you have the characteristics of Saul or the characteristics of God? Because let's be honest, a lot of y'all are in church. A lot of people are in church, and God been left your leader, like he been left Saul. God said, if you read 1 Samuel, before I even get to this fight, he said he left Saul and sent a tormenting spirit upon him. But Saul was still leading as king. God was no longer there. So most of you guys in church and God not even in that church. I remember one time I was going to the church, getting to know the church, and a couple of things happened that I was like, wow. The first thing that happened was they had a guest speaker. The guest speaker came on the pulpit, and I kid you not, I do not make this up. And she was cursing words out of her mouth. I paused. I said, ooh, how could she defile the altar of God? This is God's. And she was like, oh, but God know where I'm at. God know my heart. No. God do not take disrespect from nobody. He didn't take it back then, and he's not going to take it now. You respect God's altar. Then I had to realize, and none that she was able to disrespect that altar because that was not God's altar. That was that pastor's altar. There were Saul's servants because nobody was able to stand up to her. Not no other pastor below the head pastor, whatever they called him. No other leader. Nobody was able to say, hey, don't defile my father's altar. They were afraid to speak because if they spoke, they would have got rebuked. If they spoke, everybody looked at them crazy. Everybody backing her up. Yeah, she is who she is. All this crazy stuff. You come on, you cursing God's altar, and you saying it's okay because God know your heart. God know he's still working on. I still be cursing. This is me. No, that is not you. You know that is you, but that's not God in you. And you was able to curse on that altar because that wasn't God's altar. The same way there was with Saul. God was not with Saul anymore. He said he sent a tormenting spirit upon Saul to the point Saul has to go get David to play the harp so every night that the spirit could leave. And it wasn't until I was reading this and God gave me this revelation. And I said, wow, it's because these were servants or Sauls in this church. To allow somebody to come curse on that altar and act like it was okay. If that was me, I would have politely got up as the pastor, apostle, whatever y'all want to call it. If that person would have called himself and take the mic. No, you have to get down. Not in my house. Not in God's house. You're disrespecting God on his altar. They forgot that God killed people for disrespecting him on his altar. That you couldn't even get close to God. Only certain people back then was even allowed to get into his presence. And you telling me it's okay? You think it's okay right now to curse God's altar? Another thing happened one day. I went and I packed my stuff that moment and I walked out. Came back. I'm like, you know what? God can tell me to come, whatever it is. I came back and this was the last time I went. The house prophet, the choir leader, whatever they called him, stood on the pulpit while he was preaching. This is so you have to have a spirit of discernment. You have to have God with you. And he said he was going through something. His mom almost died. And he said this boldly with passion, not the spirit of God behind him, not the Holy Spirit, but it was just his passion and his heart. He said, my mama was about to die. And I said, God, if you let my mama die, I will stop worshiping you. Passion, music in the background playing, making him sound, hyping him up. They're his background people. He said, I told God that I would have stopped worshiping him. He said that, my mouth dropped. Why? Because I looked at him like he was a crazy fool. And everybody came in. He said, guess what? And my mama didn't die because God know in my heart. He think God saved his mom's life because he threatened to stop worshiping God. The Bible said that God will even have the rocks raised worship him. He don't need us. The trees worship God. I literally could hear. I used to think I was crazy until I started reading the Bible. I could hear outside. And I've been saying this since I was a kid. I'm like, no, I can't have people that think I'm crazy. I could hear nature worship God every day. The only person I ever told this was my best friend and my pastor. I'm like, I don't know. And I didn't really know the Bible till I started reading it. And my pastor was telling me, yeah, the Bible said, da-da-da-da-da-da. And you think he needed you to worship him? And nobody stopped him from saying that? Nobody said he was wrong. Nobody came back and apologized. Nobody was like, no, you can't. God don't need you to worship him. The wind worship him every day. When the sun come up and the sun go down, it's worshiping God. But you know why they couldn't say nothing to him? Because that was in God's house. That was Saul's house. They were acting like Saul. They was afraid. They was walking in fear. Nobody spoke up nothing because it was fear. Walking in the characteristics of Saul. So now when I look at churches, I look at, is this a Saul church or God's church? When I listen to people, I don't listen to anybody. If this is a pastor, if this is God, or is that Saul? You have to be careful what you listen to, and you cannot be afraid to stand up for God. Because check this out. Goliath came every day, right? Let me tell you, God done gave me some words to get to some people. And one thing I do, I stand on God's word. I don't care who you are. And that's what I need y'all to know. Stand on what God tell you. I done been called rebellious. I done been called a witch. I've been called so many things because God gave me a word. Now, let me tell you one thing about when God speaks, God always back me up. It's going to come to pass. Either pray, repent, or take God's warning. I don't say nothing on my own. I got my Father for sending me this. I don't care who you are. If God tells me to say, I'm more afraid of God than I am of a servant of Saul. What can you do to my soul that you think I'm going to keep my mouth shut because you the pastor? Some of them, they think, oh, you have to be ordained. You have to be this, that. No. Some of y'all just went to a class. God didn't much call y'all. Took a class, went on pulpit, and y'all speaking straight through Saul, raising up little Saul servants. But check this out, right? Let's go down. Let's go and David come in. So David come in. Let's go 1 Samuel 17. Now we're on verse 23, right? I love this. Verse 23. And it says, let me scroll to it. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came out from the Philistines' rank. Then David heard him shout his usual taunt to the army of Israel. 24. As soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away in fright. When you're a servant of Saul, you are afraid. You don't know your father. You know the one you serve. They told David, have you seen the giant? The men actually come out each day to defile Israel. The king has offered a huge reward to anyone who will kill him. He will give that man one of his daughters for a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempt from paying taxes. David said in verse 26, hold on, let's go down. We don't need to read this. Let's go down. You could read it, but let's go down. No. Okay, verse 26. He says, who is this pagan Philistine anyways, that he is allowed to defy the army of the living God? Let's read it in another version. I'm going to read that one in the New King James. Right, so it said, David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the army of the living God? He said, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? I mean, who is this man with no covenant with God? He's a nobody. Who is he that he think he could come in and disobey and not listen to the army of the living God? David was a youth, my guys. They said in the Bible that David was a youth, meaning he was a teenager. These were older people. And he came in like, who's this man? That he gonna come and disrespect my God? And then it goes on. Hold on, I'm reading my notes, right? David was standing bold because he knew who his God was. He knew his brother came to him, and his brother said, Listen, that's another thing. That's why you cannot walk in fear. You cannot be afraid of other people. His brother came to him and said, "Oh, hold on." His brother said, but when David, verse 28, when David oldest brother Eliab heard David talking to the men, he was angry. "What are you doing around here anyways?" he demanded. "What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle." Came to put David down because David was not afraid. No, ain't you supposed to be, we here in war, you supposed to be worrying about your sheep. And David told him, "What have I done now?" When I read that, I mean, this brother, this person in his life, is always on his back, trying to make him feel a type of way. David said, "I was only asking a question." That means you got to be careful, because the people close to you are going to be the ones that try to remove you off of God's path. Are going to be the ones that try to put that fear in, because his brother was walking with Saul, serving. His brother was a servant of Saul. David came as a servant of the Lord. To the point, David went to the king, and we're going to read down, and because they went to go tell the king what David was saying, and when he asked about the rewards and all that stuff, he went to the king, and the king said, let's go to verse 33. So this is 1 Samuel 17, verse 33. "Don't be ridiculous," Saul replied. "There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You are a boy, and he's been a man of war since youth." The king was afraid, but guess what? David was not afraid to go to the king and speak what he believed. David said, "I come in the name of the Lord." He was not afraid to speak what he believed. When you're a servant of Saul, you're going to be afraid. You're going to be serving Saul. Meaning you're going to be doing everything in the church, going every day, 5 days a week. You're going to be doing everything. You can be drained out. Don't even have time for your family, your kids, your husband, your wife, nothing. You're going to be serving. You got to serve. Yes, serve. But make sure you're serving God and not Saul. I'm all for being in the church. If you want to be in the church and you serving in the church and God called you to serve God the way God called you to serve God. But don't be afraid when God tell you to speak. Don't let King Saul was like, "Oh, you are nothing but a youth." I'm sorry, guys. My back hurt and my baby's like getting really big. King David was like, King Saul was like, "You are nothing but a youth. You are nothing but a boy. Don't be ridiculous." It's like you going to your pastor and say, "Listen, I could cast that demon out. God told me to cast." "Oh, you crazy? You not ordained for that? Do you even know the voice of God?" Or this and that. "Oh, God told me that y'all get afraid. Sometimes y'all don't even want to speak. Because y'all worship these Sauls so much. Y'all serving these Sauls so much that you act just like them. You think it's about your works. You think about, I have to do this, I have to do that." And God said, "I just want you to love me." David was in love with God. That's why the Bible said he was a man after his own heart. Jesus came from his lineage. Yeah, did I even pronounce that word right? Jesus came from his line. Because Saul was a man after God's own heart. Saul was not afraid to speak. Saul didn't care. He said, "I'm going to go to the king. And I'm going to stand up to this 450-pound giant who probably 10 feet tall with all these heavy armor." He was over 9 feet tall. So I don't know exactly his height. "I'm going to stand up to this man. I ain't afraid of him. And he a little old boy. And y'all grown men scared of him. Y'all supposed to be the army of the living God." To the point the Philistine said, "You are nothing but a servant of Saul." I mean, you're nobody. You serving Saul. He didn't see them as a servant of God, because he did. Trust me, he was not going to be running his mouth like that. He was not going to be talking like that. But then listen. So then, the king said, David began to tell him what he did to let me read it. Verse 34. But David persisted. I mean, he didn't stop. He knew who he was. He knew who he was serving. He wasn't serving Saul, guys. He was serving God. He said, I have been taking care of my father's sheep and goat. He said, when a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from his mouth. If the animals turn on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. I have done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine. He said, I'm going to do what I did to these animals to this Philistine. This giant y'all afraid of. He said, for he has defied the army of the living God. Nobody realized, not even people in the army realized that they were God's army. Because they were shaking in their boots. They were scared. They was terrified. They ran away from him for 40 days. The man will come up to them. They go and they run. They say the Philistine came up for 40 days, morning and noon. Was it morning or noon or morning and afternoon? One of them. For 40 days, he kept doing the same thing. When you read in the book, when you read Joshua, it's literally before this. A couple of chapters before this, I don't remember, but he was never afraid to go into battle against nobody because he knew who he was serving. He knew whose name he came in. He knew that it was God. Joshua was a servant of God. He did everything to please God, not man, God. He walked in boldness. When God told him to speak, he spoke. He had the people under him go and kill the kings and put their feet on his neck. Kings ran away from them. They were serving God, so God went into battle for them. Then David said to Saul, the Lord rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear. The Lord that rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine. Saul finally said, all right, go ahead, go. You want to go, boy, just go. You basically like, you're going to die, you want to go die, go. He gave him his armor. David said, I don't need this. This thing is too heavy. I don't want this. I'm just going to take my rocks, my stones, they called it in the Bible, and my slingshot. David went to Goliath. Goliath looked at him. Let me read it. It's so funny. Goliath was mocking David, right? Verse 41. I told you everything is coming from 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel 17. Right now we're on verse 41. Goliath walked towards David with a shield bearer ahead of him. Right? And then Goliath said, am I a dog? He roared at David that you come at me with a stick? And he cursed David by the names of his God. Come over here and I will give your flesh to the birds and wild animals, Goliath yelled. David replied to the Philistine, look, he didn't much call him by his name because Goliath meant champion. Goliath meant giant. He called him the Philistine, the one who have no covenant with God, who have nobody with him. David did not even call him by his name. He was like, oh, who does Philistine think he's talking to? He said, you come to me with sword, spears, and javelins, but I come to you in the name of the Lord. He said, I don't need all of that stuff. I'm coming to you in the name of the Lord. In the name of the Lord. The rest of the army, they couldn't even stand up to him. They didn't much remember the name of the Lord because they were so scared. They just knew Saul said it couldn't happen. We know it can happen. This man is big and we scared. David said, you come with all this stuff. You got your sword. You got your spirit. You got your armor. You have all this thing. I don't need none of that. He was not even armored up. He said, I'm coming to you in the name of the Lord. One name. Right? I'm coming to you in the name of the Lord of heavens of armies. The God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head. And then I will give the dead body of your men to birds and wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescued his people. but not with swords and spears. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us. Goliath moved closer to attack. David quickly ran out to meet him, reaching into his shepherd's bag, taking out a stone, one stone, and he hurled it with a slingshot, and it hit the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank in, and Goliath stumbled and fell face down on the ground. Goliath was down by a rock, a slingshot and a rock. A slingshot and a rock. And guess what? After God done defeated that giant, David went up to him, took his sword. He took the Philistine sword. Let's call him by what he was. He wasn't a big, powerful champion. He took the Philistine sword and cut his neck off, like he said he would do. Because he knew who he served. So who are you serving? He knew who he served. And after he took his head off, he took off his armor and put it in his tent. And then he took the head back to the king, to King Saul, the youth, the shepherd. He was a teenager. He said he knew who he served. He didn't care that everybody else was afraid to speak. He didn't care that these people were shaking in the boots. He didn't care how big he was. He knew how big his God was. He said, this is the army of the living God. Who is this Philistine coming to disrespect him? So ask yourself, who are you serving? Who are you pleasing? Are you trying to just please your pastors and your leaders? Are you trying to, make them happy instead of making God happy? Are you not speaking when God tell you to speak? David went to the king and said, listen, yeah, they telling him no, everybody looking at him crazy, especially his brother hating on him. And David said, I ain't afraid of him. Not only am I going to kill him, I'm going to cut his head off. He knew who he served. When you are a servant of God, you have the characteristics of God. You bold, you strong. Nothing can shake you. When you walk in the characteristics of Saul, when you are a servant of Saul, you're fearful, you're afraid, you're weak, you're timid most of the time, too scared to go talk. They probably even, they tell you go say something, oh no. They're going to rebuke me, they're going to say this and that about me. David didn't care what he had to say. His own brother came after him. Again, he said, what have I done now? And David still held his ground. He said, the same thing I did to those bears and lions, I'm going to do to this Philistine. And that he did. Do you have that boldness in you? Because when I go to a lot of churches, or I see a lot of church folks, I hear people talk, or when I meet people, and I look at some of them, I'm like, man, God have so much plan for them, they're afraid. And I didn't know what spirit that was. I realized that was the spirit of Saul, the servant of Saul. I'm like, they was afraid. They're afraid to do everything. They have so much wisdom. God called them to do so much. Matter of fact, God be like, go online and go live. I don't care if it's 2 people, go live. Or go evangelize to this person. They can't do it. Why? Because one day, I heard a pastor once say, oh, this man told him, God told him to preach. And the pastor said, no, God didn't tell you to preach. And the boy sat back down. Why? You think God tell me to do something? I'm going to care what anybody have to say? I don't care what you guys say. Once God speak to me and I know it's God, I don't care what nobody else have to say. I'll come to out of respect, but I'm not coming for your approval because God gave me the approval to go. So if you see you have those characteristics, or your leader have the characteristics of Saul, you need to check yourself. And you better go have a talk with God. Don't be Saul's servants. We have too many of Saul's servants on this earth already. Too many. And I'm tired of seeing it. I'm tired of seeing Saul's servants walk around. That's why the church ain't got no power. Ooh, my camera shifted. Sorry, I kind of hit the tripod on my feet. That's why the church, some churches ain't got no power, because God not there. You saw how weak Saul was, how weak his army was, because God left him. God said, I sent a tormented spirit to Saul. But because the army was serving Saul and not God, it's like that spirit kind of fell right onto them too. It fell right onto them. Because they started acting just like, they act like they had a tormented spirit on them as well. Pray. Fast. Have a relationship with God. Don't let your relationship be you going to when you have a relationship with God, it will keep you from being Saul's servant. Going to church, don't going to church does not mean you have a relationship with God. You don't know nothing about your Father, nothing about your Savior, nothing about the Holy Spirit. You're going to get fed by the people feeding you, and you don't know what they're going through when they get home. That's a topic for another day. But you have to make sure you have a relationship with Saul. You have to have a relationship with God. Build that relationship. Read. Reading is a big factor. Read. Talk to Him. I did a simple prayer yesterday, and I didn't have to go deep into prayer to say, God, I don't want to feel the pain I felt when I last took that shot. Because I'm about to be due. Baby might be coming early. Everything's on God's will. And I have to take this shot. And I took it before my last baby to help the baby lung develop. And it hurted so much. And they let you know it's going to be painful. It's going to burn. Blase, blase. And I said, God, every time I take this thing, it hurt. But you didn't let that wax hurt when I prayed. Please don't let me feel nothing. And God was like, okay. I went to go get that shot. I felt nothing. They all was shocked. I was shocked. I forgot that I even prayed. Talk to Him. Tell Him about your day. Ask Him how He doing. What's he thinking about right now? What's going on in the heavenly? What's going on this earth? But form a relationship with Him. So when you speak, you know His voice. Form a relationship with Him so you will not be a servant of Saul. David had a relationship with God that the army, Israel's army did not have. A youth stood his ground because he knew who he served. Know who you serve. And if you're not serving God, change that right now. All right, I'm going to go. Once again, everything came from 1 Samuel 17. Y'all can read all of it. I prefer that you read the whole chapter, like that whole book. 1 Samuel is really good. But read that part and the chapters before it if you want to get a feeling of where David was coming from and to see what happened to Saul before all of this and how they went from being God's army to Saul's army to the point the Philistine was able to see it. All right, I'm going to go. Until next time.